Hello, everybody. This is Ken Johnson at the University of New Hampshire with Dan Lichter at Cornell University. And we're going to talk about our new research on rural America. I'm going to share my screen with you. If any of you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and there should be time to talk about it at the end of the webinar. So this work is by Dan Lichter and I, and I'd like to acknowledge the New Hampshire Agricultural Experiment Station and the Multi-State Regional Project 4001 for support for this research, as well as the Andrew Carnegie Foundation. We're talking about rural America, and as you can see, the title of the talk is it failing or succeeding? And we want to suggest that it's doing both. This is based on our demography article, peer-reviewed, that was just published a week ago. And you can see the title there. And if anybody is interested in the article, if you download the brief for our research brief, you'll be able to, at multiple places, to connect to the article. So the article gives more technical details and more information. The brief focuses on the key issues that are relevant to policymakers. So this analysis uses counties as the unit of analysis, and we include population data from the decennial census from 1970 to 2010, and then we use population estimates through 2019. So that's the source of the data, the demographic data. We're going to look at how metropolitan and non-metropolitan areas are defined. That's done by the Office of Management and Budget in the federal government. A metropolitan area consists of one or more counties which have an urban nucleus of at least 50,000. Think of it as a city or a town. Any counties that are integrated with that center county as measured by commuting data, and any county that's not included in a metropolitan area is by definition non-metropolitan. And we're going to use the terms metropolitan and non-metropolitan interchangeably. We're going to use the terms metropolitan and urban interchangeably, and the terms non-metropolitan and rural interchangeably. Now, after each census, counties are reclassified based on whether one of their urban places went over 50,000, which would make them a metropolitan area, or whether a county gets more connected to a nearby metropolitan area based on commuting patterns. There have also been definitional changes in the Office of Management and Budget's definition of metropolitan, minor changes through the decades. So we're looking at the period from 1970 to 2019. We're dividing the counties into three groups. There's 1,954 counties that have been non-metropolitan since 1970. That is, they were non-metropolitan then, they are still non-metropolitan. There are 419 counties which were metropolitan in 1970 and are still metropolitan. And then the ones we're particularly interested in is the 753 counties that were non-metropolitan in 1970, but have been reclassified as metropolitan by 2013. So just to make sure you understand what went on here, after each census, the counties are reclassified. And so what you can see on this graphic on the left-hand side is the reclassification of counties. Often it's around 100 counties a decade, or sometimes it's a little more, sometimes it's a little less. So here we're showing you using data from the demography article, which used a classification system developed by John Cromartie at the USDA. We're showing you the change each decade in the proportion of the population that is metropolitan or non-metropolitan. So you can see after each census, the number of non-metropolitan counties and the number of people residing in them, which is the digits you're seeing here, diminishes. So one key point, after every census, the number of non-metropolitan counties gets smaller and the number of metropolitan counties get bigger. This is an overview of that. So on the right-hand side, you can see the number of counties as they were classified in 2019. So the blue counties are the ones that stayed metropolitan throughout the period. The orange ones are the ones that were reclassified. And then the 419 metropolitan counties are the ones that have been metropolitan since 1970. And most of these continuously metropolitan counties are the older urban cores, along with the inner suburban counties attached to them. So they were already metropolitan by 1970, actually by 1963, and have stayed so. So the ones, again, we're interested in are the orange ones, the ones that were reclassified. On the right-hand side, you can see how much of the population resided in each of these areas. So 46 million people lived in the areas that were non-metropolitan in 2019. Almost 71 million were in the counties that were reclassified. And then the counties that were metropolitan in 1970 and continued to be metropolitan have about 200 and roughly 211 million people in them. And so one key point is that 71 million people and 753 counties that were classified as non-metropolitan in 1970 have been reclassified as metropolitan by 2013. So that's a lot of people and a lot of counties that have shifted from being non-metropolitan to being metropolitan. So when you hear reports like the report that in 1970, 1/3 of the American population lived in rural America, and now it's only 14%, the first thing you think of is big floods of people moving from rural America to urban America. When in fact, what's happened is a lot of counties that were once non-metropolitan have been reclassified to be metropolitan. 753 counties, 71 million people. The orange counties on this graphic are the ones that were reclassified. So if you look at a place like Chicago, you can see the original metropolitan area of Chicago as it stood in 1970. And then around the outer edge, you can see orange counties, which are counties that have been added to that metropolitan area. And you can see that this is widely dispersed across the United States. It's somewhat more common in the South and in parts of the West where there are many more counties that have been reclassified. It's less common in the Northeast. Just to give you a couple of ideas, a couple of new metropolitan areas, the Casper, Wyoming metropolitan area was added during this period. It has about 80,000 people in it. Burlington, Vermont is another one that's been added that was non-metropolitan in 1970, now metropolitan. That's 220,000 people that shifted from the non-metropolitan to the metropolitan side of the ledger. Among the reclassified counties, you can see Nashville, Tennessee, which has the original gray counties at its core, surrounded by a ring of orange counties, which are reclassified. In those reclassified counties in 2019 were 900,000 people that shifted from being in non-metropolitan areas to being in metropolitan, not because they moved, but because the counties themselves were reclassified. Same thing in the Denver Boulder metropolitan area. You can see the relatively small number of gray counties that are the original Boulder and Denver metro area. In the parts that are orange and were reclassified, 1.1 million people were living in 2019. So that's a substantial shift of population from rural to urban areas. Now, of course, part of the reason this happened was because of urbanization and the sprawl of metropolitan areas outward. But one point that's pretty clear is that after each census, some of the most successful non-metropolitan counties, the ones that have grown the most, that have the most economic activity in them, are redefined as metropolitan. So it's obviously there has been migration and movement within the United States as well. But the key point is that it's partially because of this reclassification. Now, how exactly does this reclassification work? This is the amount of population increase in each of these types of counties in each decade. So you can see, for example, in the 1970s, the counties that were or would be reclassified grew at about 2.5% annually. The metropolitan counties grew at a little bit less than 1%, about 0.8%, and the non-metropolitan counties, the ones in blue, actually grew a little faster than the metropolitan counties. That was during the period of the rural turnaround when rural America was growing quite a bit. After that, you'll see consistently that what happens is it's always the reclassified counties that grew the most. And it's always the rural counties, the non-metropolitan counties, that grew the least, with the metropolitan counties, the ones that are continuously metropolitan, growing faster than the non-metropolitan, but not as fast as the reclassified counties. Now, the reclassified counties gain population primarily through migration. That is net migration into them, some of it coming from rural counties, a lot of it coming from the older urban core counties, and by natural increase, the difference between births and deaths. In the metropolitan continuous counties and the non-metropolitan continuous counties, most of the growth came from natural increase, from the excess of births over deaths, although there was migration gains in these two, and we can have migration gains in all three kinds of counties because of immigration. In the last period between 2010 and 2019, for the first time in American history, the population in non-metropolitan counties actually declined. So these are the big sweeping demographic trends that underlie this, what's going on. Now, Dan's going to talk a little bit about what the implications of these trends are. Dan, you need to turn on your speaker.
Hello, everybody. My name is Dan Lichter from Cornell University in upstate New York. Welcome. I'm going to talk a little beyond some of the narrow numerical results that Ken discussed. I want to talk about four main implications of our results. I think the most important one is that our study addresses this commonplace or familiar narrative of rural decline and malaise. I think it's just wrong based on the evidence that we presented here. In fact, the fastest growing non-metropolitan places that grew up to be metropolitan, they grew faster than the metropolitan areas that were metropolitan the entire time. So there's really a story here of two rural Americas. One that's successful. By successful, we mean sufficient growth to become metropolitan. And then we have those non-metropolitan areas that literally have been left behind, both figuratively and in reality. I don't think that this minimizes some of the problems today in the 14% of the U.S. that still is non-metropolitan by definition. These rural areas today are the result of a selective winnowing process that has drained, I think, not only population, which we've focused on here, but also human capital. When you look at the people that are being redefined, even without moving from non-metropolitan to metropolitan, it includes people with lower levels of poverty, higher levels of education, better jobs. They're younger, they're in their reproductive prime, that is, they can add to the base of the population through fertility. And the result of this, and I think we've seen this in many media reports over the last 6 months to a year, is that the rural-urban divide has actually gotten bigger as a result of this process. A third implication, I think, is that rural urbanization is really, in some ways, exurbanization. It's occurring at the metropolitan fringe. Those are the fastest growing areas. I mean, there are some, for example, Bismarck, North Dakota, that have become metropolitan over time in their own right, but most of this growth is occurring at the urban fringe. And it really is literally where rural and urban meet, where the values of old timers, these long-term rural residents now, and new suburbanites, mostly commuters from the city who go back and forth between the suburbs and the city, actually come into, in some cases, conflict, but there's a meshing of the rural-urban, something we sometimes call the rural-urban interface. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind when we look at what do we mean by rural? Well, the boundaries for rural and urban are very fluid, and people can become one or the other without actually moving, just by virtue of the growth around people. And I think that's occurring today at the metropolitan fringe, where so many of these counties have experienced growth, so that rapid growth. So the metropolitan areas are expanding, and they're expanding at the expense of some of the rural areas. And lastly, I want to just say a little bit about going forward. With this successive winnowing process, which has resulted in absolute depopulation in rural America over the last decade, fewer and fewer rural counties, non-metropolitan counties, are likely to grow up to become urban or metropolitan areas. And so I think we're going to see less, perhaps, of this in the process. And I think what we might see is some of these smaller metropolitan areas that had been previously defined as metropolitan are now lagging in population growth. We see that now in upstate New York, for example, with Rochester and Syracuse and Utica and Albany and counties in that area, where we're going to see a sort of return now to a non-metropolitan areas. And what does that mean? It's going to exacerbate the rural and urban differences again, because some of the slow-growing metropolitan areas are going to get redefined in the future to become part of the non-metropolitan population. And again, that's going to have the effect of slowing or even contributing to decline in non-metropolitan areas over time. But that's just speculation. We're going to have to see what happens after the results of the 2020 census are released here soon. So those are what I see as the main implications. Ken, you may have some other ideas. I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, one other thing I was going to say along the lines you've just been discussing, Dan, is it's important to recognize that not all of what's left of rural America is declining. In fact, there are areas in rural America, whether they be places where there are substantial natural recreational amenities, whether it's places with nice towns and a comfortable environment, which are doing well are also doing well. So it's not as if everything left in rural America is fading, but there certainly are parts of rural America that face real challenges as we move to the future. So just to summarize, again, since 1970, 25% of the counties containing 70 million people and 22% of the population has been reclassified from non-metropolitan to metropolitan. And one key point that I want to emphasize again to you is that all the growth in the proportion, not the number, but the proportion of the population that resides in metropolitan areas, from 66% of the population in 1970 to 86% of the population now, all of that growth in the share of the population that's metropolitan is due to reclassification. If we were to look only at those original metropolitan counties, they actually contain 64% of the population now. So the growth in the share of the population that's metropolitan is entirely due to reclassification. And this transfer of population through reclassification, as Dan was just pointing out, raises questions about the commonplace narrative of rural decline and urban growth. Rural America is not declining because tens of millions of people are leaving it to move to metropolitan areas. The difference is that parts of rural America are being redefined as urban, as urban sprawl occurs, as successful rural counties grow to the point where they become reclassified as metropolitan. So I think that should temper some of the pessimism that we hear about rural America now. And I think it also serves as a cautionary lesson about how we talk about rural America. It really depends on when you're talking about rural America, what proportion of it is urban or rural. So those are all critical points that I think we've presented fairly clearly in our brief, which is available for download from the Carsey website. Or if you're interested in more detailed findings and more detail about demographic change and how it occurred, you can read our article in Demography, which, if you get the Carsey brief, is referenced multiple times, so you can just click on the reference and go right to the Demography article. So if there's time, we can take a couple questions, I think, Laurel.
Okay, Ken and Dan, a question that's come in. What implications will the 2020 census have for reclassification in the future?
Well, I'll answer. I mean, Dan already mentioned that to some extent. A lot of it depends on, well, frankly, how well the 2020 census is done, for one thing, because many rural areas are among those most prone to be undercounted. So that's one sort of technical risk factor. Another thing I would say is that the American population has grown much more slowly between 2010 and 2019 than it has in the past. It's been one of the slowest population increase rates for a decade in the country's history. So I think there's going to be with smaller growth in the population. I think that we may well see less counties reclassified after the 2020 census than we have in the past. As Dan pointed out earlier, though, that's still speculative, and we'll have to see what happens when the census itself is done. The reclassification probably won't occur until about 2023. It's usually 3 years after the census that the OMB actually produces the reclassification and identifies counties as either metropolitan or non-metropolitan. Dan, did you want to say anything more?
Did you ask me something, Ken?
I asked you if you wanted to add anything to that answer.
No, I'm good. I've got a jackhammer outside my office here, so I'm having a little bit of a hard time hearing.
Okay. That's what happens. Now that's from being in the metropolitan area, right, Dan?
That's it.
Okay, I have another question for you. What kinds of non-metro counties seem to be the most successful from a demographic or economic standpoint?
Well, since Dan's dealing with a jackhammer, maybe I better answer that.
I literally can't hear. I literally can't hear the question. I'm sorry. Can you take that?
I'll take it. So what kinds of rural areas or non-metropolitan areas are doing the best? Well, non-metropolitan counties that are right beyond the urban fringe are one part of the rural America that tends to do well in each decade. The other area that we're seeing doing quite well, especially as the recession has receded, is counties that tend to attract recreational migrants or that are retirement destinations. And there's, of course, overlap between those two. Those areas have done relatively well, not only because of the migration of retirement or second homeowners to those counties, but also because as those people come to those rural counties, they create more opportunities for the population that's already there. And so more of those people stay in those areas. So there has been, in a variety of areas around the United States, growth in rural America. So we're not trying to portray rural America as all declining. Certainly there are places, especially out on the agricultural Great Plains or in places where there's a lot of low-cost manufacturing where counties are facing challenges. But there are other parts of rural America that are doing quite well. Laurel, do you maybe have one more?
Okay, yeah, let me ask you, can immigrants revive rural and small town growth?
Dan, can you hear that?
Is this the one that's on right now about the COVID?
No. The question was about whether immigrants could help to re-energize rural growth.
Yeah, I can take that. Yeah, we've done some work looking at whether immigrants can provide a kind of demographic lifeline for rural America. In fact, if you look at the last 20 years, about 60% of the growth as a result in non-metropolitan areas, 60% of the growth is due to the in-migration of Hispanics, both first and second generation primarily. So the thing about it is that the in-migration of new immigrant populations, which includes refugee populations, are it's spatially uneven. Most of the growth is occurring in maybe 10% of the population of the counties account for 50% of the growth. So it's quite uneven, but many local area groups are viewing immigrants as a potential panacea to long-term decline. And we see that even in discussions about what are sometimes called heartland visas, where new immigrant or refugee populations can move into rural areas. There'd be a residency requirement that they had to stay there X number of years, but it would be part of their visa and their entry into the United States. So immigrants can play a big role in rural America, and they have already over the last 15 or 20 years since the legalization of people here who came unauthorized.
Okay, and we have a couple comments that have come into a question in the chat box. Post-COVID, what do you think we might expect in terms of movement due to people's ability to work from home?
Yeah, I've gotten I talked to the media a lot about this. I don't think we know enough yet to be sure about what impact COVID is going to have on migration patterns in the United States. I think there's a lot of people who are temporarily in rural America. Often it's people who already have second homes there, who are working there for the summer. But I honestly don't think we know enough yet to know for sure. And certainly we won't have good data on the impact of COVID on migration patterns in America for certainly at least another year.
Can I just add to that? And when you look at rural America, I mean, and Ken can speak to this maybe better than I can. The only rural areas that are really growing, the only rural or non-metropolitan counties that are growing are those with natural resources or amenities. They're recreational areas that usually have more affluent populations with seasonal housing and so on. Those are the only areas growing. The ones that are depopulating are not areas that the urbanites or the people are fleeing to escape COVID. But I do think that we've learned a lot with COVID in terms of internet connections and so on. But the problem is in many parts of rural America, they lack the infrastructure. Some of the most remote and least settled areas that maybe have been depopulating for 50 years or longer are the ones that lack the infrastructure, even in public libraries, to, if they have them, to engage in either work or other kinds of activities where they can work from home. So that's still going to be a limitation unless we work on the infrastructure.
Yeah, I agree. I talked to people who help with economic planning in rural America, and they told me that 20 years ago, the first question they would get from people who wanted to perhaps open a factory or open a business in their area was how good was the road system, and could the bridges tolerate the semis crossing them. Now they told me that the first question they ask is how good is the internet service. So I think that's a huge disadvantage in some parts of rural America and something that really should be addressed.
Okay, and then we have a comment that's come in and then another question. So the comment, if you'd like to respond, is just a mention, caution on saying, as Ken did, that success equals sufficient growth to be metropolitan. Much of rural America would not agree with that, and the urban refugees from COVID-19 living in rural right now would not either.
Well, I mean, I think that's true. We were defining success just in terms of the demographic success of increasing population size enough to become a metropolitan area. Certainly, much of rural America doesn't want to be more populated. And I mean, that's an entirely relevant comment. The only thing I would say, and I've talked to many rural audiences in many parts of America, and although many of them are quite comfortable with not growing or growing slowly, I have been in few places where people are happy that the population of their communities is declining, that they're depopulating. And that is happening in a significant share of rural America right now. So while I agree that the definition of success is shifting from non-metro to metro is simplistic, and many people wouldn't agree with it. You know, I was speaking primarily in the demographic context of being redefined as metropolitan.
Okay, very good. And one last question. Why do you think most of the reclassification is ex-urbanization versus new metro areas?
Yeah, that's a good question. Dan, you want to?
Yeah, I can. I mean, most of it, I mean, the requirements to be considered a metropolitan area or a part of a metropolitan area at the periphery of a city, say, as opposed to becoming a metropolitan in your own right, has to do with just the criteria for establishing residency. You know, we're not talking about that many non-metropolitan cities of upwards of 50,000 or more, and that's what you have to do. You have to cross that boundary or that level of population size in order to even be considered a metropolitan area in your own right. So that's part of it, and I think most of those places that are growing up have already passed that threshold. And I gave some examples in the Dakotas. You can think about Rapid City, you can think about Bismarck. There just aren't that many of them out there yet that are close enough to that 50,000 threshold where that's going to happen. And the ones that are going to be close to that 50 threshold in some time occurs that are metropolitan areas that have already, metropolitan cities that have already declined below the 50,000 threshold. So they're sort of going back and forth. The growth is occurring at the periphery because mostly because people who are in the inner suburbs are either moving out even further in response to change in employment and population characteristics of the near-in suburbs, including new poor neighborhoods and minority neighborhoods. They're moving out further to the edges into undeveloped suburban areas or gated communities, or they're moving back into the city as part of the gentrification process. Before we talked about metropolitan areas not growing as a proportion of the overall size of the metropolitan population in America, well, part of that had to do with the cities themselves depopulating. Absolutely. We see that in many rural parts of America. Upstate New York is one of the better examples with Rochester and Syracuse and so on. Those cities have actually declined and all the growth is occurring at the periphery. And those are formerly rural areas. Those are the exurban areas that we've been talking about. So there's no simple answer to population change, and it's different depending on the history, the cultural history of areas, the economic history of areas, whether they're dependent on agriculture, small manufacturing, or timber, or whatever. So it's very difficult.
Okay, I think that's probably all that we have time for. Thank you very much. Again, you can get the brief, download the brief from the Carsey website, and also get our demography article. If you just look at the brief and click on the demography article mentioned, you'll go right to it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.